To thank everybody for joining us today on the Roadmap for Implementing Next-Gen 911 GIS Data Model, Part 2. My name is Keri Brennan. I am currently the president of URISA, and I will be acting as your moderator today. We've got some amazing presenters today. We have Hillary Palmer, who is GIS addressing guru, with Matanuska Susitna Borough in Alaska. I just about said bureau, I'm not sure why. And then we also have Melissa Liebert from Comtech, who is going to be taking the lead in this presentation. We have Wendy Nelson, the Executive Director of URISA, on as well. She'll be helping me moderate and following along. If at any time you have questions during the presentation, at the bottom of your display screen, you will see a chat dialog box. If you could type your questions into the chat dialog box, we have everybody on mute. So if you could just type your questions in there, we will either go through the presentation and address questions at the end, or if it is something really that needs to be addressed right away, we will, I'll interrupt the speakers and we will address it right away. If at any time you have any technical difficulties, you're unable to hear or see the video, we understand everybody has different audio and video connections. You can reach out to me directly in the chat dialog box or to Wendy, or you may want to exit out and reconnect into the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be made available after for a period of time. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Hillary and Melissa.
Thanks, Keri. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Melissa Liebert. I work for Comtech Telecommunications. Thank you for joining this webinar, Roadmap for Implementing NG911 GIS Data Model Part 2. Welcome, especially if you were able to either participate or view our Part 1 of this little webinar series. So let's jump right in. So this webinar is going to be speaking specifically about the Civic location layers within the NENA GIS data model. The Civic location layers are the road center lines and the address points. So you'll see that both of them are location validation of Civic addresses based on street name, address ranges, and community values. And the road center lines is often used in other 911 systems. If you're familiar working with your PSAP, then you probably work with the CAD system and use the road center line for that for things like vehicle routing. And address points can also likely be used in other 911 systems you've participated in. And an important aspect of the address points for NG work is it is not required to be complete. So if you have, say, even one address point and you can put it into your NG system, that is honestly better than no address point. At least it can be considered like a placeholder while you update and migrate all of your local data into your site structure address point layer. The reason, one reason why this is possible, why you don't need a complete data set, is because address points aren't the only point in validation for next generation 911, and also NENA developers and the 911 community understand that many jurisdictions don't have address points, and that it can be pretty costly and resource intensive to develop those. So these all have very similar, or both of these layers have very similar hurdles that I'm sure many of you have probably experienced. So they can come from multiple, quote, authoritative sources. If you have a city within your jurisdiction, and then you also are dealing with a county entity, you can be dealing with multiple standards. Sometimes they can be pretty politically charged, tied to your, say, commissioners, election campaigns, or you might not have the ability to make your own addressing standards due to maybe both the multiple authoritative sources, or because there's some political pressure not to. And they're, I mean, like I said, they're both riddled with a lot of issues that are far outside of a GIS personnel's control. And they can be pretty frustrating both when developing and when maintaining your data. So before I move on to the next slide, I wanted to touch on one aspect of authoritative. You'll hear that a lot in GIS, you'll hear it a lot in 911, and I like to think of it authoritative to what purpose, because it's really thinking about what are you going to be using your data for, because a roads department or your assessor's office definitely has different needs out of the data than for 911 purposes. So definitely when you're sourcing your data, getting a sense of what the criteria when the data was created can help you extract what you need to create a solid NG911 data set. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where we start and some background. So I'm going to turn the time over to Hillary, and she's going to kick us off on this section.
All right, thank you, Melissa. So implementing NENA's Next Gen 911 GIS Data Model standard feels like a pretty daunting task. Here are some tips that helped me get started. First, I obviously just suggest you read the standard and then read it again. I happen to be a tactile learner, so if I really need to understand something, I have to print it out, put it in a 3-ring binder, and go crazy with Post-its and highlighters. If that's your style, do it. There were some terms and acronyms in the standard that I personally did not understand, so I was able to download the NENA Master Glossary and have my questions answered that way. Next, I highly recommend taking some free Esri training for using Model Builder to automate your new workflows. The class I took was only 2 hours long and it was free. Back to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Hillary. And I did want to mention one more standard that's particularly can be useful, especially if you're developing your own site structure address point. And that is the development of site structure address point, GIS data for 911. And I'll be highlighting some of the aspects and information that's in that document, but take a look, it's only 64, 74 pages. But it's a good document if you're just getting started. So things to keep in mind, if it's not current, the system won't have the whole picture. So you need to make sure that your workflow that you establish always has the most current data, which means building those relationships with your data sources and the stakeholders so that they feel comfortable sending you updates and there's an open dialogue, which I know is oftentimes easier said than done because there can be some history between entities. But especially for 911 purposes, it's really important to have the most up-to-date, accurate data so that it saves lives. Standardization, the whole point of the GIS data model was to create a data standard for 911 purposes. So that the PSAP in Oregon has the same data standard as the PSAP in Maine, and even has the same data standard as Quebec in Canada. This is a national, international standard, and it's being written as such, so that there's that interoperability piece of the work. Make sure that you have good quality data. It's garbage in, garbage out, and oftentimes you are going to be the data source. And so what you say is the source of truth. So make sure that you're not putting garbage into the system. There are some safeguards put into place to try to ensure that the data being put into the system is good data, but some data just, it needs local knowledge. There's no real computer that can really identify some data problems that may exist within your data set. And then be just committed to that accurate quality data. And this is just a funny cartoon about competing standards. It's, you know, there's 14 standards. Oh, that's ridiculous. We need to develop one that, you know, everybody uses. And then there's 15 competing standards. So it's kind of the unfortunate thing about standards. But we are trying to, the NENA community, 911 community is trying to look at one body of documentation as the standard bearer for 911 purposes specifically. So the data model layers, we'll just go really quick. This was definitely covered a little bit more in depth in part 1. And so if you have questions about anything in this section that I'm breezing over, feel free to look back at that part 1. But again, this one, we're going to be talking specifically about road center lines and site structure address points. Part 1 talked about the provisioning boundary and the emergency service boundaries. Both are required. I will mention that site structure address point, just for a little bit of history, at one point was going to be put as strongly recommended. And then kind of 11th hour, they decided that no, it needs to be a required layer. Again, even if you have just one point in there to start building up that data set, it is a required layer for next generation. What you need to know about, so PIDA flow, presence, information, data, format, location, object. You can see the little graphics. So you have your GIS database. It goes into a lost server, which is location object, service translation. This works with some validation of points and gets spat out over to your PSAP. Sorry about a lot of acronyms, but the specific here that we really care about is the information format that PIDA flow needs, and that is the Civic Location Data Exchange format. This provides consistency, interoperability, backwards compatibility. And so CLDXF is often new to people. So just a little bit of background on PIDA flow and CLDXF and the CLDXF document. So this is a document that is going through a revision right now. They're in the public comment phase, I believe. So the next version should be coming out shortly, but it's a map profile that takes that PIDA flow and some of the core services elements. It maps the civic location data elements to corresponding Federal Graphic Data Committee, et cetera. And it can provide an illustrative example of data parsing, and you can see Appendix C of that document. So CLDXF, the biggest change in CLDXF that many GIS people may not be used to is that CLDXF boils down to fully spelled out data elements. So instead of ST for street, which is like Pub 28, you have fully spelled out, so STREET street. Same with all of the other abbreviations that likely are in your data set. Again, this is different because it varies from what the USPS Pub 28 says. And the reason is CLDXF is created to support emergency call routing, and it allows for automated matching between many different address lists and mapping sources. So it goes back to that standardization, interoperability, allowing different systems to communicate not only within the US, but also internationally. It also covers more layers of geography, including municipalities, community, and neighborhoods. As you can see on the slide, the two fields that are still abbreviated is country and state. And then CLDXF also is a complete parsing of street names, which this helps because it fixes deficiencies in the existing telecommunication systems and the USPS formats, and it is an XML standard. So with that in mind, we will continue. So just some of the basics that are covered in the data model: identification, contact, quality, spatial reference, lineage, legal, temporal, metadata, and reference. Each one of these has its own separate section in the data model, goes over the quality of data that you should look for when you're building, such as your spatial reference, because at least, for that one, oftentimes UTM zones and state planes are pretty common. And this again just puts everybody on the same page, at least for not necessarily in your development, but when it gets into your spatial interface, which is the kind of the first stop for your GIS data. So I will turn it over to Hillary, and she will talk a little bit more about the NGUID, which is the unique ID for each of the layers. Go ahead, Hillary.
Thank you, Melissa. So one important new field in each of the required data sets for the next-gen GIS data model is the NGUID, or the NENA Globally Unique ID. This field can be auto-populated using a nightly stored procedure that concatenates 4 main elements: the data set abbreviation, a unique ID, the @ sign, and your agency identifier. Next slide. Thank you. The dataset abbreviation portion of the NGUID will be RCL for the road center lines layer, SSAP for site structure address points, PSAP for the PSAT boundary layer, and so on. The unique ID portion of the NGUID does not need to be a specific number of digits, and you can use the auto-generated database object ID if that works best for you. The agency identifier is simply your registered domain name as defined in the NENA Standard 10, Detailed Functional and Interface Standards for the NENA i3 solution. There's a couple examples. The first one for the agency identifier was my own, but it could be whatever pertains to you. And back to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Hillary. And then you can see some examples down in the lower right-hand corner of what it may look like, that RCL, the unique number, and then the domain name. It is important to be unique, not only in your own organization, but again, if you're comparing your data to data even from your neighbor or across the country, you want it to be unique. So that's why you can't just use the object ID. You could use this example of a RCL and then a Esri global ID. That it is very unique. It's, in my opinion, it's just long. For error reports that you might receive from other aspects of the NG system, I have always found that the shorter NGUID like RCL or SSAP 3 at your domain. It's just easy to identify which feature needs to be examined because it's just really short versus using the Esri global ID. I don't, off the top of my head, or looking at it, I know that it's in the RCL layer, but then I have to hunt down that number. So in the data model, you'll see 3 attribute conditions: mandatory, conditional, and optional. They're abbreviated MC and O. Mandatory means you must populate it. Conditional is you must populate it if it exists. And then optional is completely up to you, doesn't really impact your NG system, and can often be useful for like your CAD or more like local purposes. So when you are starting out, some really good questions are looking at what you have, what you need, and where can you find it. So taking a look, examining your data and figure out what you're missing, and then exploring what's the best data sources for your 911 purposes. What is the most accurate data and where can you find it? So let us dive into the first Civic layer, which is road centerline. The road centerline is used for NG911 validation, call routing. Again, it can be used for map display, CAD, vehicle routing, emergency notification. So a lot of uses for your road centerline. Your road centerline, just some general topology rules. It should have proper directionality. It should break at response boundaries, which more or less should be, it's obviously you break it at attribute changes because it's a different segment, but it should also break at response boundaries. And then you need to snap to your neighbor's data, which involves communicating with your neighbor, potentially creating snap points and agreeing to where it meets on your borders. They should not self-intersect. They should not be multi-part geometry. And most of the time, they shouldn't be stacked, or I should say they shouldn't have intentional stacking. There is a situation with like, say the road is on a jurisdictional border, and the left side of the road has, say, Main Street, and the right side of the road is Highway 202. So it's the same road, but different jurisdictions call it a different name. So you might have a situation there where it's stacked. You can also resolve that just with left and right attributes. I just wanted to point out that make sure you don't have any unintentional stacks. You might have a stacked road for more like 3D highways. When you have the big bridges that you'll see or that you experience, those would likely be stacked, and those are acceptable. Some attribute rules, they should correspond with your associated addresses, have all the mandatory fields populated, have the conditional fields populated, and sync with your MSAG. Your MSAG is your Master Street Address Guide. It's associated with your 911 call routing, and it is not spatially assigned and can oftentimes be a house for really junky data due to just poor management depending on your organization. So you can use your GIS data to clean up your MSAG, and you can just make sure that they are synced up properly. often some problems that I've seen with MSAG and RCO when you're doing your synchronization effort is multiple spellings creep into MSAG. Sometimes it was, a dispatcher who was also in charge of putting things in MSAG. They just couldn't figure out how to spell a name. And so they put their own version of the spelling into the MSAG system, which might have felt fine and dandy at the time, but now you have, there's really only one spelling of that road and you have two instances in your MSAG. A very important rule for your road center line is that you do not have range overlaps. So don't have Main Street 1 through 10 and then Main Street 5 through 20. This may cause issues, especially with your neighboring, if you're having to deal with like neighboring data, and just with call routing, vehicle routing, it just causes issues. So make sure that you don't have any range overlaps within your road center line data. If you crack open the data model, this is what you will see for the road center line section. So kind of just breaking it down. So the mandatory, conditional, optional fields, you can see on that third column abbreviated. And so you have your discrepancy agency ID and your date updated. So if there's a problem with the data, who will fix it, essentially, is what especially that discrepancy agency ID is. Then you have the road center line NENA globally unique ID, which we discussed earlier. Again, it has to be unique across all aggregated data. So using that format that we recommended earlier is helpful in that. And then you have your, could be an actual, could be potential ranges from your to froms left and right. And then you have your parities, which is, I know it just says even odd there, but can it be even odd, both, or null, which Hillary will talk about. And then you have a whole bunch of fields for your street name. Again, you have to parse it out. So you can't, so even though there's only one mandatory field, you can't put Main Street North in one field. You need to break those out into their respective fields. And then you have a bunch of fields. You see legacy, ESN with these asterisks. Those are considered transitional. They won't be used in an NG system, but they are very helpful when you are transitioning out of your legacy E911 system into a fully I3 NG911 system. Those fields are also really helpful when you're doing synchronization work with your MSAG, because oftentimes your MSAG is going to still have those abbreviations in them. And so rather than having to create like crosswalk tables, just having your legacy field, legacy names populated is very useful. And then you have some of the PIDA-flow items. And so the validation sequence is country, state, county, incorporated municipality. If you are in a jurisdiction that has a lot of unincorporated communities, I used to work in one, then in that situation, most of my data, because that field is mandatory to be populated, you just populate it with unincorporated. And then you put the unincorporated name into the unincorporated community name field. So that way you fulfill the mandatory requirement with just saying the incorporated name is unincorporated. And then if you would like, I do just to make sure that I have all ducks in a row, you can put the actual unincorporated community name in that appropriate field. Don't feel bad if you don't have all the information for every single field in the data model. That's why things are mandatory, conditional, and optional. So attribute parsing, again, really important, and especially since a lot of these fields might not be familiar to people. So you have your two types, street, court, loop, road. Make sure, if you go to there's a NENA registry, you can see a lot of combined post types. Multiple word, so interstate highway. So instead of saying like I-5 or I-95, it's Interstate Highway 95 and breaking that out. And then your local knowledge is also really important to know if it's East Mason or East Mason, or North Road versus, you know, where do you put that north? If you were to auto parse it, it would probably put North Road, with the north being a pre-directional when north is actually the street name. So this is why you and your job are important, because local knowledge is required. This is also can be an issue when you're hiring even a vendor, just because they might lack that local knowledge that you have. Not that vendors are not fantastic and they do great work, but again, local knowledge is very important. Definitely a new thing when I was starting to work with NG was the modifiers. So you have like alternate, then Route 8, or your post modifier like number 9. So, you know, South Shore Mall, Access Road, number 9. And you're really breaking out those pieces of information. And then you have your separated from name, before and after directional, old, east versus east, front road, again, extension as a modifier. There are a lot of examples. If you're looking at both of these parsing pages and going, I don't know how to parse my data, both in the CLDXF document, and particularly the new version coming out, it has a significant number of example tables that you can take a look at if you're unsure how to parse out your information. And so I recommend taking a look at that document. And if you don't read the whole thing, because it is rather lengthy and technical, at least seeking out those examples so that you can figure out what the proper way to parse your roads are. Okay, I will pass the baton back over to Hillary, and she'll talk a little bit about some situations that crop up when building and maintaining your road center lines.
Thanks, Melissa. So here is an example from right here in Alaska. We had a new roundabout built between Trunk Road and Bogard Road, and I wasn't quite sure how to handle roundabouts with respect to the new parity fields in the next gen GIS data model for road center lines. So all of the highlighted segments that you see are never going to have someone addressed off of them. So I set these segments equal to an address range of from 00 to 00. So in this case, when I'm deciding my parity, it's not even, it's not odd, it's not both. So I used a parity of Z. Next slide.
I will jump in just one comment.
Sure.
Sometimes a range of 0 to 0, your CAD system does not like it. It's just something built in. So just be aware that while NG is perfectly okay with it, your CAD system may not be. Okay.
I will look into that next week. Thank you. Here is another fun example that we had locally. We had North Catalina Drive, used to be a cul-de-sac. You can see kind of the parcel line looks like it used to have that bulb end shape. And then the road is punched through and continues further north. Well, that one house that used to be on the odd side of the street is now on the even side of the street. And for whatever reason, their address didn't get changed. And I didn't have permission to change the address, or let's say that person was well connected with our local assembly and raised a stink about it, or in one situation where I've wanted to change someone's address, I gave the person a call and they actually ended up being fairly mentally handicapped, and just it became clear to me through our phone conversation that this person was not going to be capable of going through the process of changing their physical or mailing address, or reposting a sign, or retraining themselves should they need to call 911. So there are occasionally some oddballs out there where the address doesn't get changed based on even or odd side of the street. So in this case, for that side of the street, I used a parity of both. I hope that I hope this example is helpful in illustrating some different situations where that's applicable. Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks, Hillary. Okay. Now we're going to go to site structure address point. I will, just as a pause, I know this is a lot of information. And thank you. I see there's some questions coming in. So keep them coming, and we'll try to get to them at the end. So site structure address points. So again, these are used for location validation, call routing, map display, emergency notification, can be used for vehicle routing, CAD, but doesn't have to be complete. General topology rules, I apologize, that shouldn't have ended up in there. So I will just verbally, so some general, your site structure address points, make sure that by way of topology, that I never advise to put points right on top of each other. And then an important aspect of the attribution is to make sure that you don't have any redundant, repeated address points. That's where the sub-address fields really come into play, and I'll discuss those a little bit in a little bit. So again, very similar to the RCL layer, road centerline layer, you have your discrepancy ID. You have a slightly different placement of your county, country, and state fields. Again, it's the same validation sequence, same rules for incorporated versus unincorporated. There has to be a value in incorporated. So if it is not actually in an incorporated municipality, just put the value of unincorporated in there. Don't put like null or something like that. Just put unincorporated in that field. You have your same as the road center line. So all these fields above legacy, where it starts saying legacy, have to be CLDX compliant, which means all attributes have to be fully spelled out. And then again, you have your transitional attributes, which in this case can help when you're doing any synchronization checks between your alley data, which is like your telephone number data, and your GIS data. These fields are going to be updated with the CLDXF version 2. That was actually kind of the main point of that document. And so it's broken up and better defined as to what a floor is, what a unit is, what should you put in the additional location information field. The reasoning behind the update is because oftentimes, especially the additional location information, was kind of turning into the kitchen sink. So if you couldn't figure out where to put the information anywhere else, you kind of were a lot of professionals were putting it right there. And so the updated version breaks these up a little bit more and clarifies the definition of each, such as like wing. I'm pretty sure that's one that's being added. And then sometimes, or there are just extra pieces, and it just can be helpful for response. You can see like elevation. We're not quite at, we're working on X and Y location. We're not quite to Z yet. But if you have your elevation, especially for like multi-unit type or multi-floor, and you know what it is, lucky you, And I would definitely populate it just for, even if you don't need it now, you may need it in the future. Attribute parsing for site structure address points. You have your address number prefix, which can be A, your address number, and then a suffix. So if it was, if you have A21 versus 12B, or it can be by grid. You can have half addresses. All of those are oftentimes in our data sets, and this is how it is recommended to parse those out. Multi-unit addresses are special. So again, make sure that your sub-address fields are populated so that you don't come up with a topology error of having repeated addresses. So you'll have, such as 112 might be the center of this whole complex, but each one of these dots are also, 1220. So each one of these dots are also 1220, but they might have different wing names or different building names or different suite names. So making sure that you populate all of those is very important, and may take outreach to figure out, where to put the dot for your address point and how to properly populate those sub-address fields. I will say some vendors actually require you to put a single point and then in addition to the multiple points. You can see the center point's kind of what looks like in a courtyard, so probably not really a building, but some vendors may require you to do that for validation purposes or for like your alley to GIS synchronization, because I know we're talking about the kitchen sink. Sometimes it can be difficult to match your alley and your site structure address points because there's this additional location field in your alley, which likely will not match your additional location field in your site structure address point. It kind of also turns into a kitchen sink on the telecom side, the carrier side, and there's no standardization over there. So you can pull your hair out trying to get your carriers to put logical values in there, or sometimes the recommendation, again, is just to put a dot in there. So I'm going to try to, buzz through these because I do want to get questions. So placement methodologies, these are from that document I was discussing, that is site structure address point placement methodologies. So, you can geocode, you can put it on a parcel, you can put it on a site, you can put it on a structure, you can put it on the property access. So there's definitely pros and cons to all of them. Geocoding can be great, but you have to watch out for your ranges. So if, if the road actually ends at 170, that's great. But if, your address is really, the road really ends at 170, but your range actually went all the way to 199, all of a sudden your addresses are not necessarily accurate. And it might take a little bit more manual effort to fix them when it's just very range sensitive. Using parcel, using just your centroid can be useful. But is it on the structure? You can use it. You can do a little bit of a combination between your road range and your parcel, so it can be closer. But again, the point isn't necessarily on the structure. Different examples of structure. If you have a structure layer, polygon layer, and using that as a centroid, that can be a very useful layer when you're building your site structure address point. This is again like a multi-unit, the center versus having a point on each one. And then property access. I hear about this a lot. This Brent Road, North Lathrop Road, is a good example because even though this house has a Brent Road address, the access is really from North Lathrop Road. So knowing that, because if you were using like a geocoding methodology to place your points, it would probably place the point probably in this water which isn't necessarily helpful, even though it's on the property. And I know that's more for vehicle routing, a usefulness, but it's just something to keep in mind if you're building this data set. So I'm going to go to helpful tools and tricks and pass it over to Hillary.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So based on my experience, I just have some little helpful tools and tricks that may be helpful to you. For example, if you foresee needing to enter any information repeatedly, you might as well standardize it by using a domain. Here are some good candidates for domains, the ESNs, the MSAG community, and incorporated municipality fields. For my jurisdiction, the Mat-Su Borough, we happen to have 3 cities, City of Houston, City of Palmer, and City of Wasilla. Everything else that is outside the cities gets a value of unincorporated. And then, like Melissa mentioned, I could use the unincorporated municipality name field to put Mat-Su Borough. I loved using Model Builder to help automate my transition stage. I'm still maintaining legacy data while also maintaining next-gen data. Model Builder has been my friend. I've used it to field calculate legacy values over into the new next-gen fields and then use the replace geoprocessing tool. Something I learned the hard way is that if you happen to run replacements on east before south, your model will see the S in the word east and insert the word south, leaving you with a lovely directional prefix of east, south. Likewise, if you run replacements on boulevard before road, your model will see the RD in boulevard and insert the word road, helpfully leaving you with a street post type of boulevard road. So how do you get started? I suggest that you choose which data set will be your first victim. Make a copy of the data and practice adding new fields and performing those field calculations to bring existing data into the new fields. Use Model Builder to automate this new work and test it out. Document your new workflow for editing or creating new roads or addresses. Coordinate your plans with other GIS analysts to find out if your schema changes will affect their stored procedures or data services. Also, make sure you coordinate with other GIS users in your agency in case new field names will cause problems with maps or apps they author or use. It's helpful if you let them know what you're up to and why, and reassure them that you'll be communicative of any schema changes before they happen. I gave my folks 30 days notice of the proposed changes, and then again 2 days prior, and then I reached back out to let them know the changes had been finalized and offered to help them remap their labeling fields in ArcMap if they needed help with that. Open communication significantly cuts down on any resistance to change. Next slide. We watched a lot of Westerns growing up, so when it was time for me to decide if I was ready to pull the trigger on implementing the NG911 data model, I couldn't help but hear Clint Eastwood saying, "Do you feel lucky?" So here are a few pointers for when you're feeling lucky. Plan an outage for making these schema changes. If you're using a versioned SDE database, remember you'll have to stop data services, make the schema changes, redo your database replication, and then restart your data services. Update your models in Model Builder so that your input is now the real data, not your test data or copy. Eventually, you can export your models as Python scripts and have those run under the database service account as nightly stored procedures. And let your GIS users know that you have prevailed and thank them for their cooperation. The good news is that making schema changes is far less dangerous than living in the Wild West. Next slide. And also, I just want to drive home the point that transition state is the new normal. You may have business needs like maintaining GIS-derived MSAGs in the ALI database, or maybe map annotation layers that will continue to require that addresses and road center lines be in legacy format. You don't need to wait until those business needs go away before implementing the next-gen GIS data model. This transition phase may last a couple years, but when you're maintaining data, where you are maintaining data both in legacy and next-gen, just remember transition is the new normal, but it's going to be okay. We will get through this.
Okay, and here is both Hillary and my contact information. If you guys have any questions regarding the content, I know that URISA will be posting this. This was recorded. So if you want to share it with your organization or rewatch it, again, or just reach out with questions to either one of us, we would be happy to answer those. And with that, I am going to turn it over. Wendy and Keri, do you want to do the next slides, or do you want to do questions, and then the last couple minutes we'll do what's coming up, exciting things for URISA?
Let's do the questions. We've got a couple of questions in the chat dialog box. Chad asked, he was curious if anyone has used an MSAG conversion service, an MCS, when transitioning to next gen from legacy. Personally, I have not. I don't know of anybody that has. Melissa or Hillary, do you know of any?
I did not personally, no. Do you know of anybody, Melissa?
I haven't heard of anybody using an MCS. I know there are several vendors who use an MCS out there. There is a little bit of a misnomer. So thinking that the MSAG conversion service will like convert your GIS into MSAG form, which would be super awesome. But actually what an MCS does is it's just converting that flat file MSAG data into that XML PIDAFlow format, or it takes your PIDAFlow data and converts it into a flat file MSAG format. So it's not quite the magic cure that a lot of GIS people think it might be. There is a solution out there, and it's more, I've heard it called a GeoMSAG, and that's taking your GIS data, the vendor, I guess you could technically do this locally, but your vendor will take your GIS data and then convert it into that flat file MSAG data, but that's not an MCS. That's just it's a transitional step. I know the GIS transition working group for NENA, which is another document that's being worked on. I think they're going to be touching on more of a GIS-based MSAG, but it's not an MCS. But again, to answer your question, I'm not aware of any. I am aware of jurisdictions using a GIS-based MSAG.
Yeah, and Melissa, just to follow up your point, GeoMSAG is a product by a vendor. A geospatially derived MSAG is just that. It's taking your GIS data and deriving an MSAG file format out of it, but there are some additional steps. It's not just a matter of exporting your data into a table. Chad did have a follow-up saying it's a web service that can convert an address between two formats using a GIS database with dual attributes as a decoder ring between the two. It's very interesting. I think it's definitely something that people should probably explore if they are, if they have an interest. Rachel asked where we might be able to find the CLDXF version 2 document. The existing 2014 document is on the NENA website. That's nena.org. I believe, and Melissa, you might be able to answer this as well. I believe because it is just at public comment, it is not a published document, therefore it wouldn't be in the standards area for the NENA website.
Correct. Right. Yep. When it's finalized, and they're close, so I anticipate by at least the end of the year that will be published, if not before. But I know they are very close to getting that finalized.
And if anybody wanted to make public comment, what would the best way to take a look at that document be? Contact NENA?
Contact NENA. Yeah. They'll get you hooked up.
If you go to the NENA.org website, there is an area for standards, and there are links there for contact. And then one other question that came up was, what are the links to the recordings? And I reposted those in the chat dialog box, and I will repost them one more time at the bottom of the chat dialog box. URISA has a YouTube channel. That is where the webinars are currently housed. And if you go to urisa.org/webinars, there will be a link to all of the publicly available webinars. Are there any other questions or comments for Hillary and Melissa? All right, I don't see anything popping up in the chat dialog box. Melissa, did you want to move on to the next slide? Do you want me to?
I can talk about them. So if you're not already a part of the URISA community, I highly recommend you make an account and go into your URISA Connect. It's a great resource to ask questions. Stay connected with your fellow URISA members. It's just it's a good format and a good platform. And so there's the URL at the bottom that you can follow, and there's NG content on there. If you don't see it, it's just you can post your own questions and kind of get some mentorship and really feast upon that body of knowledge coming from your peers. And then some upcoming events for URISA, really big. So upcoming URISA program, the virtual GIS-Pro this year, like many of the other conferences that were supposed to happen in person and have moved virtual. The GIS-Pro is one of those. And I will do a little bit of promoting on a couple of the workshops that are going to be happening. You get one free workshop with your price of admission, or I believe you can just sign up for the workshops, but there's going to be a NG911 kind of a basics half-day workshop during the virtual conference. And there's also going to be a more in-depth look at the data model called Unpacking the Data Model. It's one that I am blessed to be a part of, and that will be an all-day workshop. So if either of those topics interest you, I definitely think you should sign up for one of them. Or there's several other awesome workshop topics that are going to be presented, and there's going to be an NG911 tracked during that virtual conference that is going to have best practices from real life GIS professionals, both from the kind of that urban regional planning, local government level, all the way up to vendors who have a lot of experience in the field. Will be talking about some of the tips and tricks they have seen to help people out. And then the URISA GIS Leadership Academy, virtual in November, and then hopefully, knock on wood, we'll be able to see each other again next year. And so June, August, and November, you can plan on attending those, whichever one's closest to you. And Keri or Wendy, do you want to make any other comments?
Just as a wrap up, I really want to thank both of you, Melissa and Hillary, for putting on this great presentation. Want to also thank everybody who attended, and hopefully you have a good place to start with your conversion into the next gen GIS data model. Please feel free to reach out to Hillary or Melissa if you have any questions, or as a URISA member, go in and log into URISA Connect and join in all of the fun.